He asked for speed, but what saved him was a wire. A frontline mechanic slipped a small Z-shaped piece of piano wire into a P-38s aileron cable to kill the tiniest lag, and pilots say that change rewrote how the Lightning turned against the Zero. Before dawn at Dobadura, the air smelled of fuel and wet earth. James McKenna ran his fingers along the boom panel and felt the warm metal grit. He wasn't a designer. He was the person who heard the twang of a loose cable and knew it meant a heartbeat of delay when a pilot yanked the stick low and slow. Doctrine said, never turn with a zero. Reality said, sometimes you had no choice. Reports from the line had a pattern. The aircraft was fast, the guns were fierce, yet rolls came a breath late. Pilots described it as moving through syrup. McKenna could reproduce the feeling with his hands. Pull, a soft give, then tension. Within spec, the forms said. Within spec did not help the kid who had 3 seconds to live. Hayes was that kid. Young, capable, and already haunted by a wingman's last radio call. The night before the mission, he asked for anything that could make the Lightning roll quicker. McKenna told him to come back at first light. Then he stayed alone with the airplane, a flashlight tucked in his neck. The boom opened like a rib cage. Metal creaked. Mosquitoes fretted the lamps. He shaped the wire into a neat Z, fighting the spring steel with pliers that slipped and bit his thumb. The fix wasn't fancy. It simply preloaded the cable so the first millimeters of stick travel didn't vanish into slack. It was the kind of idea that would never survive a staff meeting but could survive the night. Installing it meant breaking rules. No authorization, no paperwork. He worked one-handed in the cramped space, dropped a clevis pin, found it by feel, and pushed the parts together until the cable hummed tighter. He pulled on it. No give. He closed the panel, wiped the blood with an oily rag, and listened to distant engines prowling the dark. For a moment, time just stopped breathing. At 07:42, Hayes lifted off. Sun washed the Gulf and threw hard light under the wings. McKenna stood at the edge of the strip, a small figure among fuel drums and tool carts, and watched the formation fade north. He had gambled his career on a sliver of wire. Somewhere ahead, 18 enemy fighters were already drawing their circles in the sky. Contact came fast. Hayes rolled into the dive, the guns chattered, the first target slid away, and that was when he felt it. The Lightning didn't hesitate. The roll snapped like a door on a fresh hinge. He reversed and the nose came through clean, the sight settled, and shards trailed from a shrinking silhouette. He didn't celebrate. 2 more shapes were dropping on him from above. Old training said run. His instincts said turn now. He hauled left. The airplane came with him instantly, not a whisker of lag. One pursuer overcommitted and bled speed. Hayes eased a line of fire across the wing route, then broke again before the debris finished falling. But the real storm hadn't even started yet. Up high, other pilots were watching. One of them later said the Lightning looked lighter than it had any right to be, as if someone had peeled weight from the controls. They would ask questions on the ground. For now, they simply kept the enemy off balance. The fight dissolved in minutes, smoke scribbling the sky, and the surviving Lightnings turned home with fuel needles sliding low. When Hayes rolled to a stop, he climbed down with shaking hands and found McKenna. He didn't give a speech. He only said, "It worked." The words hit like water in a desert. McKenna nodded once and looked past the runway toward the tree line, already calculating which aircraft could take the same quiet change before anyone came to count bolts. Word travels faster than orders. A flight leader asked for the mod that evening. A wingman the next. Crew chiefs compared notes in low voices, timed around inspections, and copied the Z-wire exactly. Pilots started reporting cleaner reversals, closer scissor fights, escapes that would have been impossible the week before. Some accounts claim the numbers shifted that month, others simply remember fewer empty bunks. Why did such a tiny change matter? Because air combat at the edge of a stall is measured in fractions of a heartbeat. If the first movement of the stick vanishes into nothing, the enemy's practice timing wins. If the surface bites immediately, the script flips. McKenna hadn't made the Lightning stronger. He had made it present. Stay with me. The officers would notice something soon, and the enemy would sense it even sooner. But for a few days, the advantage lived where no inspection checklist could see it. Inside a closed panel, tight as a guitar string, waiting for the next pilot to test it at the horizon's edge. Mitchell met him in the shade of a revetment 2 hours later, chute straps still slung like a bandolier. He had watched the fight from above and could not square it with the pilot he knew. Hayes was steady, not reckless, yet his lightning had flipped from bank to bank as if knife-thin. Mitchell asked what changed. Hayes pointed at McKenna. The answer was not a new weapon. It was a sliver of tempered wire bent into a Z. That night, McKenna worked with the flight leader's crew chief by lantern light. They pulled the panel, weighed the risk, and agreed to carry it together. The wire fought them, the way good steel does. Once seated, the cable took the load with a bright, taut sound. They closed the boom and left no fingerprints. "If anyone asks," the chief said, "we adjusted pulleys." Morning gave proof. Mitchell returned, saying the airplane finally answered like the one in the manual. He did not file a note. He told his wingman. The wingman told a friend. By the weekend, a pattern formed. Aircraft with the hush mod, as line crews nicknamed it, showed quicker reversals and fewer breakaway stalls. The change wasn't more speed. It was a feeling. Controls that woke at the first touch. Feelings travel faster than memos. Inspections were a problem. Paperwork demanded standard tensions, so crews learned a rhythm. Tensioners went in after the last sortie and out before the first officer's walkthrough. Cables twanged within range. Engines drew the eye first. A quiet cable drew none. Across the water, opponents noticed their timing drift. Veteran pilots began noting that the heavy twin could reverse sooner than expected. Some accounts tell of an ace who nearly collided when the American S-roll beat his trap by an instant. Whether or not that happened, many agreed on the sensation. The script they trusted no longer ran on time. Numbers followed the mood. Debriefs filled with small lines that felt large. Got inside his turn. No mush in the first pull. Couldn't shake him with the old scissors. A few pilots who had gone weeks without a victory came back surprised at their own hands. Others simply came back, which counted most. Mechanics copied the Zed with whatever they had. Trim wire, scrap spring, doubled safety wire. McKenna corrected anything risky but refused speeches. He showed the bend, showed the placement, and reminded everyone to keep the path smooth so nothing could snag. Rule 1. Change nothing you can't undo in minutes. Rule 2. Don't boast. Word reached officers in fragments. An inspector thought the cable tones a little brighter than the guide and made a note. Another found a pin that looked newer than the rest and asked a question that went nowhere. Meetings were held. The phrase, unauthorized modification, hovered like thunder. Yet the weak sorties wrote their own argument. Losses eased. It is hard to scold a result that walks into the room. Not everyone agreed. A few crews refused to touch flight control runs under any circumstances. A kink or bad copy could turn a small win into a disaster. McKenna respected the line. He was not trying to become a legend. He wanted a response that matched a pilot's hands before the enemy, as timing could bite. Factories do many things well, but they cannot hear a loose cable sing on a humid night. Fieldwork is a different sense. It hears failures early and turns the wrench where a drawing shows only a line. Engineers sent queries, a team scheduled a visit, and for a moment the runway felt very small under a wide sky. Stay with me, because the next decision would decide whether the wire stayed or vanished. Before any team arrived, a fresh fight drew the line in the sky. A section of lightnings was bounced near Wewak just after sunrise. The leader snapped a defensive brake, already planning a dive. Instead, his aircraft bit immediately. He reversed so fast his pursuer overshot into sunlight, and the wingman, late all month, suddenly wasn't. 2 short bursts, 2 trails of smoke, and the quiet you notice only after fear leaves the cockpit. Pilots talked that night about the comfort of instant control. One called it taking the slack out of fate. Another stopped bracing for the half-beat that used to feel like drowning. A young replacement asked if the wire would make him a hero. An older hand told him it would do something rarer. It would give him time to think. The visitors arrived with clipboards and polite curiosity. They found nothing obvious. The booms were closed and the reading sat inside the lines. Yet the field fix no longer fit in whispers alone. Someone finally said it plain in a debrief. "There's a small tensioner in my aileron run. It makes the airplane answer now." The room went very still. Here's the twist. Once spoken aloud, the idea had to be judged in daylight. Was it smart improvisation or reckless tampering? The answer would shape not just one squadron, but any place where a mechanic heard the same tired twang and wondered if a pilot's life was hiding inside a few inches of wire. The briefing hut smelled of paper dust and damp canvas. The engineering officer set his cap on the table and asked McKenna to explain himself. He did not spin a story. He described the slack he could feel with 2 fingers, the low twang when he plucked a cable, and the Z-shaped wire that took the dead space out of the first pull. He added the sentence that mattered most. "Sir, it answers now." No accusations, just a mechanic arguing for response time measured in heartbeats. The room split. A by-the-book lieutenant said any change belonged on a drawing first, in triplicate. A squadron leader, tired of funerals, asked for the wire to stay until someone proved it unsafe. The compromise was almost comic. Inspectors would check tensions more often, and crews would voluntarily refrain from unapproved parts. Out on the line, airplanes kept flying with cables that sang a brighter note. Across the sea, opponents kept missing their cues. Reports from veterans say the heavy twin began to meet reversals with a sharpness that felt new. One diary note, later quoted in a memoir, described an American fighter that flipped before my sight could settle. Exact or embellished, many accounts agree on the effect. Practiced traps failed by a sliver. Mitchell turned the debate practical. He asked for a small test everyone could accept. Pick 2 aircraft, leave one untouched, fly the other with the tensioner, then swap pilots. Pilots scribbled after each hop. Roll in time. Feel in the first inch of stick. Any hint of binding. The pages repeated the same plain words. Immediate. Clean bite. No lag. Even skeptics agreed the feel was different. That did not settle the paperwork, but it moved the line. Safety haunted the edges. A poorly bent piece could nick a strand or chafe a guide. McKenna made a ritual, fingertip along the run, a glance at the clevis, a tug to hear the right note. "If it doesn't sing, it doesn't fly," he told a rookie chief who tried to rush. You can almost feel their heartbeat in that silence. Rumors traveled upward. An engineering team arrived with calipers and careful voices. They asked the question they had to ask. Would extra preload add stress the drawing never assumed? McKenna answered the only way a field hand can, by feel, by results, and by the logic that a surface that starts moving sooner needs less sudden shove later. The team nodded, non-committal, and took notes for a report. Combat moved faster. Accounts from late August and early September describe more lightnings returning with powder dust on the noses and fewer holes in the booms. A replacement pilot, quiet and careful, got his first victory after weeks of nothing and called it, "Finally having the wings come with me instead of after me." Another said he no longer braced for the half-beat that used to steal his plan. Enemy intelligence noticed but could not point to a part. Wreckage told them nothing new. Engines and armament matched earlier losses. They could chart a mood shift, though. Briefings began to caution against lingering turns with the big twin unless numbers were large. Caution is a small word, but it changes fights. Back at Dobadura, the arguments narrowed. The question was no longer, does it help, but how do we bless it without inviting every risky field hack? The answer, imperfect and human, was to seek an official tensioning improvement while quietly not punishing the crews who had already acted. Paper would catch up to practice. In the meantime, the wire stayed where it worked. Hayes kept flying. He didn't chase tallies. He chased survival and watched younger men learn to trust the first inch of movement. Before launches, he would ask, "Hear the right note today?" McKenna tapped the boom and listened to metal answer. Metal groaned under salt wind. Not every story ends in metals. When inspectors finally wrote up the field trick, it entered files as an irregularity attached to serial numbers and dates. The report language was dry. It did not say that a sliver of tempered wire had traded silence for a life. It did not list the bunk beds that stayed full. By early autumn, claims and loss tallies evened in places where the fix had spread. Let's be careful. Records never line up perfectly, and memory can round off hard edges. Still, debriefs share one sentence. The roll came when I asked. That is the smallest yes a pilot can get, and sometimes it is the one that lets tomorrow happen. An idea that starts as a whisper earns its future only if it stays humble under daylight. The wire would meet formal tests, drawings, and new models. Credit would blur. Names would fade. What stayed was a lesson as old as maintenance itself. When a small fix restores the first answer, it can change everything. Quietly. The visitor team walked the line with clipboards, polite but intent. They traced the aileron runs with fingertips, asked for logbooks, and listened as chiefs repeated the same plain phrase. It answers now. One engineer, sunburned and curious, asked McKenna to show the wire as if teaching a class. McKenna bent a fresh Z on a bench and slid it in while the man watched the cable take up the first breath of slack. The engineer didn't smile. He just asked for a measurement and a flight check. They set a quick trial before takeoff. 2 aircraft. Same pilots, swapping between hops. A crewman with a stopwatch. Rolls timed from stick nudge to 45 to 90 to wings level. The numbers were small and stubborn, like all battlefield data, but they leaned one way. With the wire, each mark came a hair earlier, and the exit needed less cleanup. Pilots wrote the verdict that mattered: clean bite. The engineer circled the phrase twice and said he'd put it in the report. Safety stayed at the center. They pulled the panel again and checked for chafe. The engineer asked about long missions and heat. McKenna answered with the mechanic's gospel: inspect, listen, never ignore a new sound. Then he added a promise: if anything even hinted at wear, the wire would come out before the next engine start. You can almost feel their heartbeat in that silence. Weeks later, the official paper arrived in careful language. It suggested reducing lost motion at low speeds and recommended a formal tensioning part for future production. It did not dwell on who first bent wire on a warm night and made an airplane feel present again. Paper is tidy like that. Line crews were not. They kept installing the hush mod until something official they trusted showed up in crates. New models rolled out with cleaner controls and other refinements. Pilots who had flown both felt the difference and said so without drama. It turns when I tell it, one noted, tapping the page with a dull pencil. The field trick began to fade, not because it failed, but because engineered answers finally caught up. That is the best end a stopgap can ask for. Credit is a strange currency in wartime. Names blur inside communiques, and people who sleep near toolboxes rarely end up in speeches. McKenna never asked for a medal. He asked for airplanes that stopped hesitating and for kids to come back with the same number of holes they left with. If a citation never found him, the thanks did. Quiet nods on the line. A pilot who could finally eat without staring through his tray. A bunk that stayed warm because its owner returned to it. He wrote the same ritual in every log: controls checked, tension verified, surfaces free and correct. When a replacement chief asked why the entry never changed, McKenna said the line mattered more than the story. The story lived elsewhere now, in the way pilots began trusting the first inch of movement, and in the hush that followed when a section came home intact. Metal groaned under salt wind. In late September, replacements arrived with crisp uniforms and careful eyes. Hayes took 2 to the revetments at dusk and traced the aileron path with a flashlight beam. He spoke softly about never yanking through lag because there shouldn't be any, about trusting the first bite but staying gentle with the rest. One asked whether the wire was magic. Hayes shook his head. "It's not magic," he said. "It's respect for the first inch." A week later, weather closed the field, and the line crew finally exhaled. McKenna sat on a crate, rubbing a crease of oil from his knuckles, and thought about men he could still name without trying. He didn't count victories. He counted breakfasts still shared, and boots still by bunks. Outside, rain drummed the roof, steady as a metronome. The place smelled of solvent and wet canvas. When sun returned, guidance followed. The language was careful but clear. Reduce play in the control system wherever practical. Standardized tensioning parts to follow. The hush mod kept flying until those crates arrived. When they did, mechanics compared the new pieces to the wire bent by hand and nodded, not triumphant, just satisfied that daylight had finally matched the night. But one question refused to settle. Who would be remembered for a fix no one was supposed to see? Some stories don't end. They fade into memory. The field fix became a footnote, the way many good ideas do once a proper part takes over. Years passed. Pilots left, married, found different skies. Crew chiefs went home and learned to sleep through silence again. McKenna kept working on whatever needed to move when asked, kept listening for the lag that steals the living second. And somewhere far from the tropics, a faded photograph curled at the edges, a young man in coveralls beside a twin-boom fighter under hard sun. No caption mentions the wire. Maybe it doesn't need to. The airplane looks ready, and that is the whole point. Rumors reached the other side of the water as cautions rather than alarms. Veteran opponents began describing an American twin that no longer waited in the turn. They would bait a reversal, count the familiar beats, and then watch the lightning come through the horizon before their sight could settle. Some of those lines live in diaries, others in later recollections, and memory is a soft lens. But the shared feeling is hard to miss. Their timing slipped, and with it, their confidence. Hayes noticed the change in voices around the mess tent. Pilots who used to talk about speed started talking about feel. They compared the first inch of movement like cooks compare flame. The younger ones asked if this meant they could brawl with anything now. The older hands said it meant they could choose when to refuse a trap. For a moment, even the jungle seemed to listen. But the real storm hadn't even started yet. Pressure moved downward from those quiet improvements. Sortie planners stopped overcompensating for turn fights and began drawing routes that let the lightning dictate the pace. On the line, crew chiefs adopted small rituals, a fingertip along the run, a patient tug, a quick pluck for the right note. If a cable thudded instead of sang, no one argued about schedules. The panel stayed open until the sound was true. One afternoon, a replacement pilot tried to praise McKenna like a celebrity. McKenna shook his head and pointed at the aircraft instead. "Respect the first inch," he said, "and the rest of the fight will have room to breathe." The kid nodded, cheeks flushed from the heat, and ran his palm across the boom as if greeting a horse. For a heartbeat, the war felt merciful. Rain hammered Dobodura for 3 days. Mud swallowed boots, and canvas roofs hissed like kettles. Engines coughed awake and died as crews adjusted mixtures for air that felt like soup. The field smelled of hot oil, damp rope, and the sharp clean of solvent. Metal groaned under salt wind. When the weather broke, combat returned with its usual indifference. A mixed sweep met resistance over the coast at mid-morning. Hayes caught a flash of red markings and rolled in, not to chase a duel, but to break a formation. He slipped a short burst across a wing to scatter the pair, and then reversed so fast his own wingman blinked. The enemy tried the old scissors and discovered the rungs were closer together now. What came next would rewrite everything they thought they knew. Back at the hut, the engineering team placed a stack of typed pages on a crate. The summary avoided heroics. It recommended a standardized method to reduce lost motion and proposed an approved part for production models, with a caution about workmanship during field installs. It did not mention any one person by name. That omission sat heavy for an hour, and then became what most omissions become. A fact everyone already understood. Mitchell read the summary and shrugged. Paper followed practice. That was victory enough. He asked McKenna to walk the new men through the ritual again. McKenna did, speaking as if he were teaching the care of a musical instrument. Keep runs smooth, avoid sharp contact points, prefer a clean path over a clever one, and listen. If the note dulls, find out why before the sun goes down. Enemy briefings, according to accounts gathered later, adjusted tone. They advised avoiding prolonged turns with the heavy twin, unless holding clear advantage. A few aces ignored the line and paid dearly. Others adapted and fought vertical more often, which narrowed chances but kept them alive. Tactics shift when respect enters the room. Reputation arrived in the way it often does, through small, precise outcomes. 2 flights survived a bounce that would have been fatal in July. A young pilot who had never seen a victory marker chalked one on the board after a clean, fast reversal. A veteran stopped gripping the stick at the knuckles every time he approached low speed. Even the crew that refused any field change admitted that the newest production birds felt truer in the role. Late that month, Hayes flew a long escort with the horizon smeared in heat. He found himself staring at the cable fairing before engine start, thinking about what no one would ever write down. He had 11 missions worth of close shaves in his shoulders and a fresh steadiness in his hands. When the props blurred, he felt calm rather than lucky. You can almost feel their heartbeat in that silence. After landing, he walked to the line shack and dialed a number he had copied from a fading letter. The call routed through places with names he would never see. When a voice finally answered, it belonged to the man who had taught him to check the small things on the farm. His father. Hayes did not talk about victories. He talked about a mechanic who listened to wires and made an airplane answer on time. His father said that sounded like the right kind of miracle. Recognition, when it came, was sideways. The squadron received a note praising overall maintenance standards and hinting at innovations filtered through channels. Commanders shook hands with pilots in a line, and the line chiefs watched from the shade. McKenna signed a receipt for new parts, filed them under the right shelf label, and kept bending Z's until every ship in his care had either the approved piece or his quiet one. Maybe that's how change begins, quietly. The war kept teaching the same old lesson. Ideas do not care about rank. They care about timing, material, and the courage to act when the gap between a hand and a hinge is stealing lives. The fix was small. The outcomes were not. And somewhere above the islands, a pilot rolled through the horizon with no lag at all and understood, in a way words rarely manage, what it means for a machine to be fully present. Autumn's map filled with pencil routes and spare margins. Crews could now plan around choices instead of fears. Hayes found himself teaching what he had only just learned. You don't win a turning fight by praying. You win it by removing the empty breath between intent and motion. New arrivals listened with the intensity of people who understood that knowledge here drew the line between a letter home and a name carved in wood. Enemy reports, gathered later, suggest their veterans felt the change before they could name it. A practice trap depends on rhythm. Break the rhythm and the trap snaps on air. A few opponents shifted to quick slashes and climbs, surrendering the slow circle where they had once ruled. Others pressed the old patterns and found themselves staring at gunfire they hadn't planned to meet. The line's rituals hardened into craft. After each landing, the access screws dropped into a small tray with a musical clink. A flashlight beam slid along the guide, slow and careful. Fingers traced for any burr that might fray a strand. A soft pluck, a raised eyebrow, a nod. If the note rang dull, nobody left for chow. Heat lifted from cooling engines. The air tasted faintly of penny copper. McKenna would sometimes pause and look at the sky, as if listening for a decision he could not make from the ground. He did not boast about the wire. He did not mention it to visitors who wanted stories. He used the same tight words every time. Respect the path, keep it clean, and never let the first inch go missing. The next test came uninvited. Weather scattered a formation across miles of gray water, and a pair of lightnings emerged into company they did not want. The lead felt the old urge to dive away, and the new confidence to change direction first. He snapped left, then right, then left again, each time feeling the surface meet him in the instant he asked. His wingman stayed welded at the hinge. The pursuer blinked, miscounted, and opened a hole the size of a heartbeat. 2 short bursts, and it was done. And that's when silence turned into fear. The arguments on paper moved toward resolution. The formal kit arrived wrapped in oiled cloth, each piece labeled with patient lettering. Crews laid the parts beside the bench-bent Z's and compared angles and clearances. The new design spread the load and guarded against chafe. It also gave officers something they could sign. The hush mod didn't vanish. It retired with grace wherever the official part fit nicely. No citation reached McKenna. A supply officer shook his hand a little longer than normal. Hayes brought him coffee and didn't say why. Mitchell wrote a note that never found a desk high enough to matter. Recognition tends to prefer speeches. Maintenance prefers results. You can almost hear the echo of that night. Numbers in the book began to tilt toward survival. Let's stay cautious. Fog of war math is a blunt tool. Still, patterns showed themselves at the edges. More escorts completed, more pilots sleeping through the dark without flinching at phantom engine noise. Fewer mechanics rolling blankets for men who should have come back. The field learned to measure victory by breakfasts eaten. By winter, the lightning itself had changed in ways beyond a single run of cable. Pilots spoke of cleaner dives and smoother rudder feel on the newest airframes. Maybe some of that was factory learning. Maybe some of it was crews who had trained their hands to remove empty motion everywhere they found it. Wordcraft became aircraft. One late sortie ended with a dead-stick glide to the edge of the strip. Hayes coasted to a halt, engines ticking as they cooled. He climbed down and touched the boom the way a person touches a door frame on the day they move out. He thought about a cable that answered, and a man who had made it answer, and he understood the rare shape of gratitude that does not need a parade. That night, McKenna finally slept through the first rain on the roof. He dreamed of a workshop with windows open to a sea breeze and an engine that turned smooth because every part touched the next one in kindness. He woke before dawn, laughed at himself for the dream, and went back to the line. The sky smelled like wet dust and promise. War does not pause for tidy endings. Orders shifted, fronts moved, and people were reassigned by lines on maps they never saw. The fix kept traveling in pockets and habits. A chief in another group bent his first Z with pliers borrowed from a radio man. A pilot in a third squadron learned to pluck a cable and grimace when it muttered instead of sang. Across the map, small respects gathered into a larger one. When the crate of formal kits finally matched the need, the bench wire became a story told at dusk. The young ones liked the part where the pin fell into the dark and two greasy hands found it by touch. The old ones preferred the part with the sentence that mattered. "Sir, it answers now." Both versions were true. Both explained why an airplane could feel present when it mattered most. Years from that season, people would argue about dates and names. Some would say the factory already had similar ideas, others that the field forced the timeline. The truth, as usual, lived in the seam where drawings meet dirt. A sliver of tempered wire made the first inch honest, and that honesty changed the way a fight unfolded. History tends to miss the sound a cable makes when it's exactly right, but pilots don't. Stay with me. The echo of that lesson will outlast the war itself. By the time the formal kits settled into routine, the quiet shift had already written itself into muscle memory. Pilots no longer tensed for delay. Crew chiefs no longer tolerated a dull note. The airplane and the people had met in the same first inch, and that changed the mood more than any bulletin could. Even briefings sounded different, less about warnings, more about choices. Opponents adapted in uneven steps. Some insisted the heavy twin could still be trapped if you timed it brutally close. Others stopped trying when close became too close. Accounts gathered later described narrow near misses, where an anticipated overshoot turned into a faceful of tracers because the reversal arrived half a breath early. Whether each story is exact or sanded by memory, the pattern holds. Timing cracked, and once the crack showed, confidence leaked through it. Lockups and stall warnings shrank in the debriefs. Instead of mushy at entry, pilots wrote, "Bite at touch." Mechanics smiled at that line because it named what their hands had known for months. A cable that answers early means you ask it less rudely later. Surfaces move clean, hinges live longer. A pilot's plan doesn't evaporate between thought and action. Credit still drifted like mist. The kits bore the shape of careful drafting and good intent. The field fix wore fingerprints and a nick on one man's thumb that never quite went away. Hayes told anyone who asked that the only heroes were the ones who kept aircraft honest. Mitchell called it a victory of listening. McKenna waved them off and returned to the tray of screws. Then came a mission that pressed everything into one page. A mixed flight ran escort over broken cloud. Bandits rose in a climbing turn below and tried to thread them into a slow circle. Hayes led a shallow descent to cut the angle, then snapped left so hard his harness bit his shoulders. The lightning answered as if it had been waiting. He reversed again, the nose crossing the horizon like a pendulum that knew the beat. His wingman slid into place without the old lag that used to tear formations into loose, lonely airplanes. Two opponents misjudged the count and crossed each other's lines. One paid for it at once. In the quiet after landing, Hayes wrote the result without embroidery. Reversal clean, no hesitation noted. Wingman maintained cover. He didn't mention the small gratitude that stuck in his throat when he walked past the revetment and saw McKenna's hands dark with grease and calm as he wiped them on a rag. Letters home changed tone. Where they used to say, "I'm trying," they began to say, "We have a good answer now." Where they used to inventory funerals, they began to list birthdays they hoped to make. War was still itself, relentless, impersonal. But the space around each choice felt wider, and men slept more like men than shadows. An inspection board finally closed the loop with formal language. Production improvements to reduce lost motion. Maintenance directives to verify runs for wear. Field hacks discouraged in favor of approved parts. In practice, the line chiefs read the words, nodded, and did what they had already learned. Install the kit when it fit well. Keep the Z where it served better. Never ever let the first inch go missing. McKenna's ritual didn't change. Panel off, flashlight low, path clear, pluck, listen. If the note was true, he signed. If not, he kept looking until it was. He carried no speech about innovation, only a habit of respect for the places where small things become large ones. For a moment, time just stopped breathing. One evening, a young pilot asked McKenna if rules had failed them. McKenna shook his head. "Rules are the rails," he said. "We just built a switch that should have always been there." The pilot considered that and smiled like a man who had found a word he needed. Maybe that's how change begins. Quietly. By season's end, the story had already started to fade into the background hum of the war. New airframes absorbed the lesson in metal. Old airframes carried it in wire. The people who had made the difference returned to routine the way good workers always do, by showing up early and leaving the place cleaner than they found it. You can almost feel their heartbeat in that silence. Years later, different uniforms, different skies, Hayes would stand in a hangar that smelled of dust and avgas and tell a kid just learning to fly crop rows that airplanes are honest if you are. He would tap a fairing by reflex and say, "Respect the first inch." No sermon, no legend, just a sentence that once kept him alive. McKenna would keep turning wrenches in a shop with a bell that chimed when the door opened. He would listen to misfires like a doctor listens to breath. Most days he would hand back keys with the same quiet nod he'd given on the line. On the wall behind the counter, a sun-faded photo would show a younger man beside a twin-boom fighter. Nobody in the shop would ask the story. The machines would tell it when they started without stutter. And somewhere in a folder that nobody opens much, a report would still say, in tidy type, that reducing lost motion at the earliest point improves control feel and pilot confidence. It would not say that a man with grease in his thumb lines taught it to paper during a war. History didn't end there, it just paused to breathe. Winter edged in with a thin light and the feeling that the worst was survivable. Hayes marked missions on a small card he kept folded in his breast pocket. A quiet ledger of days borrowed back from chance. He was not counting victories. He was counting mornings, and the airplane that now arrived with him at the same instant his hands asked. Rumors gathered around names the way dew gathers on wire at dawn. Someone said a famous ace had been forced to break off when a twin reversed into his sight line faster than any heavy fighter should. Someone else swore he saw a lightning thread, a scissors so tight, the opposing pilot simply quit the turn. Whether those moments were exactly so did not matter as much as the shared admission behind them. The timing had changed, and with timing goes nerve. On the line, the ritual stayed simple and stubborn. Panel off, flashlight low, path clear, pluck and listen. Crews compared notes about where fatigue likes to hide and which guides prefer a touch of graphite in humidity. The new kits proved tidy and durable. The bench Zs retired to toolboxes with the respect given to elders. Nobody posed with them. They just made sure the first inch never went missing again. McKenna watched the field learn the language his hands already spoke. He had no taste for myth. If someone tried to hand him a story, he nodded toward the airplane instead. "It answers now," he would say, and the conversation would end there, because the right kind of pride is shy. By early spring, orders sent Hayes farther than any map he had drawn in school. He flew over names that felt like rumors: long coasts, sharp ridges, water flat as hammered tin. In a bright, brief engagement near Cloud Base, he rolled twice, arrested a slide with a touch of rudder, and held the sight as if balancing a coin on its edge. His wingman's voice came calm over the set. Cover held. They went home with fuel to spare and a silence that felt earned. The numbers that historians would later argue about began to lean. Losses fell where the fix had culture to live in. Returns rose where the ritual was kept. Caution again. Wartime arithmetic never fits neatly, and memory bends around grief. Still, debrief notes stack into a pattern you can read without forcing. Clean bite. No lag at entry. Reversal on request. The words are plain because the change was practical. One afternoon, a crate arrived with replacements for parts nobody loved, but everybody had tolerated. The official instructions read like a polite apology to the people who had carried the gap by hand. McKenna set the papers aside and checked the fit. He swapped what fit well, kept what served better, and recorded everything in the tidy script of a man who understands that clarity is a kind of kindness. Letters home shifted one more notch toward ordinary. Hayes wrote about rain that smelled like copper and mango leaves, about a mechanic who could hear problems before they existed, and about the strange relief of flying a machine that felt eager to move when he did. He promised to plant rows straight when he returned, to carry this habit of honest first inches into a field that needed them. A few months later, the squadron moved on. War has a way of lifting the stage and setting it somewhere else without warning. The revetments emptied, the tents creaked one last time. The runway became a line on a map again. Before they left, Hayes walked the edge of the strip at dusk and tried to memorize the exact color of the sky when engines first catch. He could not. Some shades only exist in motion. He found McKenna by the tool chest and said, without ceremony, that he owed him mornings. McKenna said no one owes a mechanic anything but respect for the path. They shook hands once, like men who knew the measure of a small fix and a long consequence. The night insects tuned their choir. Somewhere thunder rolled far out to sea. Years scatter people the way wind scatters chaff. Hayes would fly a different kind of sky where crops make their own grid, and the only timing that mattered was the turn at the end of a row. He would teach young hands to feel for slack in everything they touched. Steering links, throttle cables, even habits. Respect the first inch, he'd say, and machines will meet you halfway. McKenna would open a small garage with a bell above the door and a scar on his thumb that oil never quite hid. He would listen to misfires and say little, fix what needed fixing, and slide a set of keys back across a counter that smelled faintly of rubber and old coffee. He would hang no medals because he had none. He would keep a single photograph where he could see it when the light angled right. A twin-boom fighter and a young mechanic who believed that answering at once could save a life. The war's paperwork would remember the improvement without remembering him. Production notes would credit engineering and use the careful words of committees. Histories would dwell on models and blocks and the seasons when dive flaps and boosted surfaces arrived. That is fair. Factories earned their lines, But somewhere under the print, the field remains. People who turned drawings into days survived, and who sometimes bent wire because a pencil had not reached that corner yet. If you listen closely, you can hear the fix embedded in other places. In checklists that say, verify runs for wear. In fingers that tap a fairing before start. In pilots who no longer brace for lag at low speed. In the small, proud quiet that follows a clean landing and a bunk that isn't empty. This is not a legend. It is a lesson about how small honesty changes large outcomes. It asks nothing more heroic than this. When a path carries intent, make sure it carries it now. Men kept flying because a cable stopped wasting the first breath of a decision. That is all, and somehow, that is everything. And so the story leaves us here with a runway that exists more in memory than on maps, with an airplane that felt present because people insisted it should, and with a sentence worth carrying forward into ordinary days. Respect the first inch. Maybe that's how change begins. Quietly. And somewhere a small light kept burning. After the war, the airfield turned back into weather and grass. Maps kept the name. But the runway itself became a memory that wakes when rain hits tin. A few posts leaned at odd angles where revetments once cast square shadows. Children rode bicycles where fuel drums had stood. If you listened very hard on a still morning, you could swear you heard a cable plucked for pitch and a voice saying, "That's the note. Now we fly." Decades have a way of sanding stories until they fit in a single sentence. The big ones get told at podiums. The small ones survive in habits. Somewhere a maintenance manual added a line about verifying lost motion at the earliest point. Somewhere a checklist learned to say, "Listen, not only measure." Somewhere an apprentice absorbed from an older hand that the path matters more than the part number. Hayes grew older with the patient grace of someone who had already used up a few lives and been given more. He did not keep a wall of photographs. He kept a pencil stub by the phone to note weather and wind. Now and then, on a late summer evening when heat went purple over the fields, he would touch a fairing screw with his thumb and smile at the clean feel of threads that start the instant you ask. He called that feeling presence, and he tried to live by it. McKenna wore the years like work clothes, faded, comfortable, honest. He learned to hear automobiles the way he had heard airplanes, by rhythm and resistance. Most people thought he was quiet. He wasn't. He was listening. Once, a young customer asked why he checked the same linkage twice. "Because the first inch decides the rest," McKenna said, and handed back the keys. The bell on the door chimed like a small piece of runway being rolled out ahead of someone. Not every archive honors the hands that keep the world from stalling. But the world remembers in other ways. In steady harvests, in letters that reach their destination, in mornings that feel earned. If you stand near an old airstrip and the wind skims the grass just right, you might catch an echo that sounds like a promise kept. And if this story asks anything of us now, it is simple. Keep your attention where decisions start. In families and workshops and offices, the first inch is where trust or trouble takes root. Remove the slack. Shorten the distance between intent and action. Make your machine, whatever it is, answer when called. The rest of the turn will take care of itself. They never spoke of it again, but everyone remembered.